Okay, I'm going to start my talk today by first giving you a little background information on who I am and what motivates me as a marine ecologist. Now, to me, this picture epitomizes the lens in which I see myself as a marine ecologist. In agreement with Jane Lochenko, the celebrated marine ecologist and currently the Deputy Director for Climate and the Environment in the US White House, I see scientists as having an obligation to engage with society and to pursue and share knowledge that addresses society's most pressing problems. This is a scientist's social contract. The older man holding the young girl's hand symbolizes scientists' ability to make beneficial links between current and future generations through sustainable practices. While the group of people on the sand, while the group of people on the sand and the sailboat on the ocean symbolizes ecosystem goods and services that are provided to us through a healthy ocean. And finally, the sun on the horizon signifies the possibility of science-based solutions yet discovered for increasingly more complex environmental challenges. Much of my work is therefore applied science that is solutions-based. I'd like to point out also that I'm originally from the Bahamas, so a lot of the experiences that I've had there have informed the marine ecologist I am today. So because I was born and raised in an archipelago, the oceans have always been a very big part of my life. And so too were invasive species. My first introduction to invasive species actually happened when I was very young. The casuarina trees you see in this picture are invasive throughout the world and are ubiquitous in the Bahamas, where they cause shoreline erosion. Many years later, when I was confronted with the Indo-Pacific lionfish invasion on Caribbean coral reefs, the idea that a non-native species could wreak ecological havoc and dominate a land or seascape, however, was not new to me. But what was different was that I was now in a position to do something about it. As at the time, I was searching for a topic to study for graduate school, and so began my career studying invasive species in our oceans. Another focus of my research career thus far is the problem of overexploitation of marine resources. Now, fishing is of social and cultural importance in the Bahamas. In fact, the children you see fishing in this photo for fun are Israel and Amani, the children of my childhood friend. And the sign Fish Fry Drive that you see in this photo from a popular place for locals to socialize in the Bahamas refers literally to frying fish in a pan to eat. And finally, fishing is of economic importance in the Bahamas. Here we see a picture of the Caribbean spiny lobster, the most valuable fisheries export in the small island state. But some of these valuable fisheries are overexploited, and the typical Bahamian is aware of this just by looking at the rising prices for local seafood. However, it was not until I met Daniel Pauly in his Sea Around Us project here at UBC on reconstructing marine fisheries catches for the entire world that I get involved in digging up historical records to understand the true scope of fisheries exploitation through time. And finally, climate change affects us all, but particularly those in small island states like the Caribbean, which sits in the hurricane belt, where the intensity of storms are predicted to increase. What really drove me to get involved in this issue from a personal perspective was when I observed the devastation caused by Category 5 Hurricane Dorian, which hit the Bahamas in 2019, killing over 200 people, displacing thousands more, and costing about $3.4 billion in damages, which is equal to 1/4 of the Bahamas' GDP. Now, although I could not address the complex social, political, and economic challenges of climate change, I could address the ecology of it. So I took what I knew best, which is the oceans and invasive species, and thought seriously about how climate change may be affecting them, and in turn, biodiversity and the goods and services that it provides to people. My motivation for studying 3 major drivers of global environmental change as it relates to ocean sustainability is therefore deeply personal. In my talk, I'll briefly highlight some of my past, current, and future work that relates to these 3 human-caused stressors. Starting with the roadmap of my talk, I'll first highlight some of my past and current work, which is a side project, in reconstructing baselines of marine resource overexploitation and exploitation. Next, I'll give a snippet of my past work that examined, among other things, the ability of Native communities to resist species invasions, And finally, I'll give an overview of some of my current work as a postdoc here at UBC, as well as a glimpse of some of the work I hope to pursue at Concordia. Now, using the fisheries of the Bahamas as a case study, my research shows how reconstructing past patterns of marine resource exploitation and overexploitation can provide new baselines for marine resource management and conservation, and offer novel insights into setting management targets for policy action. Now, if you were to base current management decisions on officially reported catch statistics for the Bahamas, you would immediately picture this: a fleet of small-scale artisanal commercial fishing vessels in Spanish Wells Eleuthera, the largest fishing community in the Bahamas. But my research has shown that this is literally only half of the story. What you should also be thinking about is this: the massive numbers of fish that are removed from Bahamian waters each year by tourists engaged in recreational fishing. Now, tourism became year-round a big force in the Bahamas when it became year-round in the 1950s, believe it or not, with the advent of air conditioning in hotels. And since then, the number of visitors to the Bahamas each year has grown substantially, so that tourists now outnumber residents by an order of magnitude. Now, many of these tourists come to relax and enjoy sunbathing in beautiful places like this, which is a sandbar in Exuma Keys, the Bahamas. But thousands also come each year specifically to enjoy this. Man, this mouse is spoiling my the flair of my talk. Recreational fishing, in which fish are caught for pleasure and may or may not be consumed. Before I go any further, I'd like to show you this figure of the officially reported catch data for the Bahamas, which comprises exclusively commercial fisheries. All of the sectors, such as recreational fishing and artisanal fishing, are missing. Now, here we have on the x-axis time, while on the y-axis we have fisheries catches in metric tons. Now, these data are important because they are used to make management decisions both locally and internationally, and are submitted annually to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or the FAO, which records fisheries catches for the entire world. So how does one determine the importance of marine recreational fishing relative to other sectors when, like commercial landings, basically, how do we know what recreational fishing catches are if the Bahamas only records commercial commercial fisheries catches? There we go. Well, one solution is to use the widely established catch reconstruction approach created by Daniel Pauly and Dirk Zeller when he was here at UBC. So I applied this method in my work, in which, in a nutshell, you first identify existing data, and then you identify missing components. And then, using alternative information sources for these missing components, you develop what we call data anchor points. Now, you typically linearly interpolate between these anchor points and then combine reported and unreported data. Finally, you express a level of uncertainty in the data sources using a framework developed by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Now, to cut a very long story short, at the end of my reconstruction, I showed that the total amount of fish removed from Bahamian waters over the past half century was 2.6 times the officially reported statistics. Even more alarming is that recreational fishing, shown here in the light green, accounted for more than half of total reconstructed catch, in which most of this unreported catch was taken by tourists. And you can see it's actually 1.5 times that of commercial catch, which is the one that is reported. So thus, by ignoring recreational catches in the Bahamas, you are literally ignoring half of the story on fishing. Now, my findings therefore debunk a common misconception in the Bahamas and globally that catches from recreational fisheries are relatively small and thus negligible when compared to other major sectors. Recreational catch constituted roughly half of my reconstructed catch and is closely linked to tourism in a small island state. Furthermore, despite bag and gear limits, the large number of participants in the fishery results in significant impacts on stocks and species that are currently unaccounted for in official statistics. But my story doesn't end there. Who cares about historical ecology aside from scientists? Well, this story also had a big impact on society. I believe that your work is not done when you publish a paper. Instead, you must also disseminate its findings using popular media, and if you're lucky, you might even be able to influence policy. So after the publication of this study, I love that it's a story more than a study to me. I was invited by the Bahamian government to be part of the official delegation to attend a 32nd Committee on Fisheries in Rome at the UNFAO. There, I presented my findings on the importance of recreational catch in the Bahamas at a side event on fishery statistics and its importance for food security. Now, my reconstructed recreational catch data were eventually officially endorsed by the Bahamian government and retroactively submitted to the FAO for the years 1950 through 2010. In other words, this study, or this story, as I like to call it, literally rewrote the history of fishing in the Bahamas. Now I'd like to show you a glimpse of some of my latest work on a side project, which I'm doing with Daniel, which involves reconstructing the sponge fishery of the Bahamas. Now, we all know what a natural bath sponge is. But what you might not know is that in the past, marine sponges were used to line the helmets of soldiers in World War I. While in World War II, they were used to clean heavy machinery and as gun swabs. Now, despite there being over 1,000 genera of marine sponges in the world, only 2 genera are fished commercially in the Caribbean. Now, in its heyday in the 1900s, the sponge fishery was the dominant fishery in the Bahamas, dominant industry, in the Bahamas, surpassing even tourism. And the small island state was the second largest exporter of sponges in the world. Now, there's a fascinating story of the history of sponging in the Bahamas, which spans almost 200 years, and involves a shipwreck and humble beginnings, fantastic growth, and devastating collapse, followed by the recent attempts to revive the industry in the 21st century. Now, I won't go into the detail about the history of this fishery today. Look out for this paper that's coming out this year. But what I do want to show you is this incredible preliminary result. Now, this is a historical reconstruction of the sponge fishery in the Bahamas, where I have time on the x-axis and sponge catch in metric tons on the y-axis. The different colors in the graph signify different species of sponges. Now, many people attribute the decline in the sponging industry in the Bahamas to a variety of factors, but mainly due to the outbreak of a fungal disease, which killed 70 to 95% of all sponges in different areas of the Bahamas before spreading to the rest of the Caribbean. However, as you can see from my reconstruction, the sponge industry had already declined substantially prior to this disease outbreak, which is denoted with that red arrow right there. And this decline, therefore, probably happened due to overexploitation and unsustainable harvesting practices. But there is more to this story. In this figure, I've now overlaid all major hurricanes, category 4 and 5 hurricanes that passed over the Bahamas during my reconstructed period. Now, hurricanes also played a major role in this fishery decline, as they destroyed not only the sponge fishing beds, but also fisheries infrastructure, such as fishing docks, fishing boats, processing plants, and warehouses where they would store the sponges over time. Now, in fact, some of the historical documents that I went through talked about hurricanes destroying commercial sponge fishing vessels out at sea, and literally hundreds of people dying during the storm, because in the earlier parts of the year, they didn't have as good warning systems to know when hurricanes came by. So a lot of people were caught out at sea, and I saw year after year after year people dying, and they recorded the names of the boats and the names of the people that died in the sponge fishery because of this. Now, if you look closely at this figure for some time periods, like the one shown in the black box here, there's a clear sudden drop in sponge exports that immediately follows a hurricane. I'm now in the process of modeling this data to determine what percentage of variation in sponge exports or catches can be explained by hurricane damages. Now, a final interesting aspect of this figure is that you can see a clear signature of the effects of climate change in which the intensity of storms is increasing. If you now pay attention to the strength of the hurricanes, in which category 5 storms, the strongest level for hurricane ever, with sustained winds of 252 kilometers per hour or higher, is shown in red, while category 4 storms, which are a little weaker, with sustained winds between 209 to 251 kilometers per hour in blue. You can see that for the past 140 years, only 2 major Category 5 hurricanes passed over the Bahamas. However, if we look at the last 40 years of this time series, that is a time period that is 1 order of magnitude smaller than what we just saw, the number of Category 5 hurricanes literally doubled in like 40 years. All this to say that disease only added to the finishing touches on a declining fishery that was basically declining due to several reasons, and some of those reasons are still playing on through hurricanes. Okay, I've put this relaxing photo here of a beach in British Columbia here to remind us all to take a good breath. Now, moving on to biological invasions, another substantial source of environmental change and biodiversity loss. I will now present one of my past studies that explores the notion of biotic resistance, or the ability of native communities to prevent or limit the success of an invasive species. Now, several factors are thought to confer biotic resistance. These include species diversity, as well as native predators, competitors, pathogens, and parasites. Now, using the Indo-Pacific invasion of the Caribbean coral reefs as a model system, I'll show how native predators can reduce the success of invasive species through non-lethal means. Now, lionfish are native to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, where they're mid-level predators on coral reefs and feed on a variety of fishes and smaller crustaceans. Now, lionfish were first introduced into the Western Atlantic Ocean in the mid-90s. And you can see their reports will be shown with these little red dots. It'll show up on the screen. Now, this invasion is particularly important to me because watch when it hits the Bahamas in 2004, because things are really going to take off then. And this invasion is particularly important to me because, like I said, I'm from the Bahamas, where the densities of lionfish in the invaded range are both larger than anywhere else in the invaded range, as well as in its native range in the Indo-Pacific. Now, fast forward to now in 2023, and lionfish are now found as far north as North Carolina in the US and as far south as the east coast of Brazil, although the somewhat dated map only shows their distribution as of May 2021. Lionfish also occur in Long Island, New York in the summers due to like the Gulf Stream bringing like really warm currents. However, they die out in winter because the winter bottom temperatures are too cold to sustain the adults. That's why you see some of those starts going beyond North Carolina there. Now, people are concerned about the lionfish invasion because they're incredibly effective predators. For instance, in some coral reefs in the Bahamas, lionfish predation has resulted in 65% declines in native prey fish biomass. And it seems as if they have no natural control because they have these venomous spines, which I've been stung by twice. So you can imagine people's surprise when this paper appeared in Coral Reefs Journal showing that large groupers can in fact eat small lionfish. However, this was an opportunistic observation involving only 6 groupers, 3 of which had small lionfish in their stomachs. And this point takes me to the question of whether native groupers can act as a form of biotic resistance to lionfish. Now, there is currently conflicting evidence about the nature of the relationship between lionfish and groupers in the Caribbean. For example, at the local scale of a marine protected area in the Bahamas, lionfish biomass is found to be negatively correlated with grouper biomass, as shown here with grouper biomass on the x-axis and lionfish biomass on the y. However, at much larger spatial scales, such as the study involving 3 ecoregions within the Caribbean, there was no correlation between lionfish and grouper biomass, as shown here. So unlike previous studies that examined the correlation between lionfish and grouper abundances, I decided to take the question straight to the grouper's mouth, so to speak. To do this, I examined the stomach contents of over 200 large-bodied groupers representing 6 species that were caught by both commercial and recreational fishers on 6 islands throughout the Bahamian archipelago. And what did I find? Not a single lionfish, thus showing that there was little direct support for direct predation of groupers on lionfish. But direct consumption is only half of the effect that predators can have on potential prey. There's also a strong and a large body of literature that shows the strong non-consumptive or fair effects in which the mere presence of predators can cause prey to alter their behaviors, so that it's more difficult for predators to detect, encounter, or capture prey. For example, cats for the most part eat cat food, but mice will still be afraid and hide when cats are around. And this anti-predator behavior of mice comes at a cost, as mice that spend more time hiding presumably have less time to forage and mate. So some species of groupers in the Caribbean are similar size and eat similar prey as lionfish, and can therefore potentially compete with lionfish on coral reefs as a form of biotic resistance as well. So I examined the non-consumptive and competitive effects of native groupers on invasive lionfish by conducting a field experiment on coral reef patches around Eleuthera Island in the Bahamas, in which I exploited natural variability in grouper densities. And this happened because I wanted to experimentally change the densities, but I was really bad at capturing groupers, and then they had this homing behavior, so they go back to the reef, and so it was a disaster. So after a month, I decided to just exploit the natural variability that I saw on reefs. Anyway, what I did was I cleared all lionfish from the reefs and replaced them with 3 or 4 individuals, which I tagged and caught from outside of the study area. Each reef therefore contained 3 or 4 lionfish in which I could identify individuals. And if you see those little circles there, you see like this little red dash, and those are visible implant elastomer tags. And so what you do is basically, it's like a liquid in a syringe. And if you inject it into the fish right under the surface of the skin, it solidifies and becomes hard, and you have different colors. And so where you place the colors and the placement and the colors of the tags can identify individuals. And the really cool thing about this is that these tags glow under UV light. And so when I'm on the reef, which you'll soon see at dawn, which is like defined as an hour before or after sunrise. So when it's completely dark on a reef, the way I'd find individuals is I had an underwater UV flashlight. I would just strobe the reef like this, and then I would see glowing colors. And I'm like, oh, that's fish LL025 or something. So I monitored the abundance of groupers and native fish small enough to be lionfish prey on reefs every other week for 1.5 months using underwater visual surveys and transects. I also recorded a series of lionfish anti-predator behaviors on reefs every 30 seconds for 30 minutes per fish, per survey, both at dawn and throughout the day. Behavioral studies also took place every other week for 1.5 months. Now, I measured 3 anti-predator behaviors by lionfish. These were hiding, inactivity, and total swimming distance. But given time constraints, I'll only present the results looking at lionfish hiding behavior today. I also examined several factors that might influence lionfish behaviors. These included large body grouper predators based either on size or species, smaller bodied grouper predators, as well as other lionfish on reefs, because lionfish continue to recolonize my reefs throughout the study, and of course, time of day. Now, I looked at several lionfish anti-predator behaviors like hiding, as shown here, and formulated numerous a priori hypotheses on factors that I thought might influence their behavior. Now, these hypotheses were rewritten as mixed effects models, which I then competed against each other using information theory, or AIC, corrected for small sample sizes. Now, so for example, in this very basic model here, I have examined the effects of 2 factors on lionfish hiding at dawn. However, these are more than just factors, as I can also infer mechanism from these models. So in this example, groupers identified based either on body size or species are acting as potential predators of lionfish, while smaller body groupers are acting as potential competitors of lionfish. So you're looking at 2 processes here, competition and predation. Now, here's one of my key results, specifically after competing 20 different candidate models related to lionfish hiding behavior alone. The top model turned out to be this really simple one. We have grouper predator density based on size on the x-axis, and the probability that lionfish are hiding at dawn at first sighting on the y-axis. Now, the bands represent 95% confidence intervals, while the points are jittered along the y-axis and indicate whether a lionfish was observed hiding within a reef, signified by number 1. You can see them hiding in the rock, or out in the open, signified by 0. As you can see, the higher the grouper predator density on reefs, the more likely a lionfish was to be hiding at dawn when they should otherwise be hunting. Now, there was 38% support in the data for this top model, which explained 60% of variation in lionfish hiding behavior on reefs was explained simply by the abundance of groupers. Now, I won't show the results for the other lionfish behaviors that I measured, but just suffice to say that lionfish were more likely to hide and be inactive at dawn when they should otherwise be hunting on reefs with high abundances of groupers. Now, large groupers are overfished throughout the Caribbean, which can therefore give rise to bolder lionfish that are more effective predators of native prey. Wow, 10 minutes? I'd also like to point out that this study is one of the few that examines the landscape of fair and marine systems, because as reflected by its name, the concept is frequently applied in terrestrial systems. Thus, by testing theories from terrestrial systems and marine systems, we can understand the generality. Now, taking a step back from the specific study, what do we mean in the broader sense of things? Well, large body predators are in decline worldwide, causing large-scale disruptions to ecosystem structure and function. But most people are only focused on the consequences of the loss of consumptive effects of predators. Here, I show that the depletion of large predators can have implications that go beyond demographic effects on prey and can, in fact, also affect prey behavior. Now, this is supposed to be a breath, but we got to get rolling, so let's go. Now, in my last few minutes, I'd like to touch on my current research, which I'm doing here at UBC, which looks at climate change effects on invasive species. And we'll see if I have time to highlight some of the work that I'm going to do at Concordia. So the oceans absorb between 20 to 30% of carbon dioxide emissions generated by human activity and 90% of the excess heat produced by greenhouse warming. Now, this results in a series of physical changes that affect oceans in various ways, from rising sea levels and increasing sea temperatures to changes in ocean circulation, decreasing pH, dropping oxygen levels, changes in salinity, and increases in extreme events like marine heat waves. At the same time, due to the accelerating rise of global trade and travel, both the rate and the magnitude of biological invasions are increasing. Our world is more interconnected than ever before, leading to increased opportunities for species to invade regions beyond their natural range. Indeed, the number of established non-native species per continent is predicted to increase by 36% from 2005 to 2050. So an important question, therefore, is what happens when these two major drivers of environmental change collide? And I approach this question by looking specifically at invasive species and climate change. Specifically, to address the gap in quantitative evidence of the effects of climate change on species invasions, I conducted a systematic global meta-analysis focusing exclusively on marine systems by examining over 2,000 publications drawn from two separate bibliographic databases on the matter. After applying a series of a priori inclusion and exclusion criteria that involved looking at things like, was the study published in English, because I can't read anything else? Was it based on a marine system? And importantly, did it quantify a biological effect? I ended up with 16 publications that contained a total of 67 studies. Now, I had several research questions, starting with the first one. Are there invasion hotspots based on this data set? Now, this question can be viewed in two ways. First, are there certain areas of the world more likely to be a source or donor of invasive species? And second, are there certain regions of the world more likely to be recipients of these invasive species? Starting with the first question, this map depicts the marine ecoregions of the world in which we have invasive species in the meta-analysis originated. Here, the color of the marine ecoregion represents the number of invasive species that came from that region. As you can see in this meta-analysis, Asia, namely Japan, appears to be a hotspot for contributing invasive species. This may have something to do with the large amounts of shipping activity that occurs in Japan, the world's third largest economy. Now, unfortunately, I can't present you the results for the regions in which receive invasive species because I'm still working on this data, but the answer will let us know where we probably need to increase marine biosecurity measures. Now, moving on to my second and more general question, does climate change facilitate invasions? Now, here I show a coefficient plot that I'll use frequently throughout this talk, in which points represent effect sizes bounded by 95% confidence intervals. Points to the right of the dashed line mean that invader success increased under climate change. Points to the left of the dashed line at 0 mean that invader success decreased under climate change. And if the 95% confidence intervals cross 0, that means that the result is not statistically significant. And the numbers in brackets there represent sample size, which is here is the number of studies included in the analysis. And the colors represent temporal scales. And as you can see, the temporal scale perfectly correlates with experimental study type in my study. So these two variables are confounded, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. And as you can see, there's a general trend for invader success to increase under climate change conditions, but the magnitude and the significance of the effect varied by study type and or temporal scale. Breaking down this general result into more specific questions, I then asked, which stage of the invasion process is most strongly affected by climate change? For those of you who might be less familiar with the stages of the invasion, there are basically 5 stages, passing from the introduction of a new species to the colonization of a new area, to the establishment of viable self-sustaining populations, and finally to rain expansion or spread throughout a new area. And then lastly, we have impact. Although the impact of invasive species is shown throughout the invasion process, it becomes most distinct when they're both widespread and abundant. So here I present a series of coefficient plots that I'll get progressively larger as I move throughout my talk. So starting with just the invasion stage is shown here by a row, while I have study type or temporal scale shown by the columns in this plot. No study type examined all stages of the invasion process that was large enough to warrant statistical analysis. So I'll only present the stages of invasions that had enough, large enough sample sizes in which I could, conduct a study. So generally, the magnitude of the effect of climate change on invasive species increases with time among study types, if you look at the y-axis scale of the x-axis. However, although there was a general trend for the success of invasive species to increase at all stages of the invasion process, only the colonization stage during experiments was significant. Now, there are several measures of invader success, and I'll therefore ask which measure is most strongly affected with climate change. Now, I decided on 6 biological indicators of invasion success, such as abundance, demography, distribution, per capita impact on native species, performance, such as changes in body growth, somatic growth rates, or increase in heat shock protein expression, and changes in phenology that actually benefited the invasive species. I've now added a second row to this figure, which represents the various biological responses of invasive species to climate change among different study types or temporal scales. Again, not all measures are shown here because of sample size constraints. But as you can see, the magnitude of the responses tended to increase the temporal scale or vary by study types once again. And as you can see, invader success tended to increase under climate change for all measures, but only increases in invader abundance over the short to medium term were significant in experiments and observational studies. Finally, I asked which climate stress elicits the largest response in invasive species. Because as we all know, climate change is not some nebulous concept. Instead, it's a combination of distinct physical changes. I encountered, and although we can't single out different components of climate change, it's important to know what those components are to understand the underlying mechanism by which these changes are occurring. So I encountered 4 different climate stressors in my meta-analysis. These are ocean acidification, extreme events such as heat waves and hurricanes, ocean warming, and seawater freshening. Now, despite 4 stresses being covered by studies in my meta-analysis, I was only able to examine the effects of 2, which were in large enough sample sizes. Lastly, I couldn't look in models because every single study that was done in models only looked at ocean warming. Now, in general, both ocean warming and extreme events tended to increase the success of invasive species, with effects generally being greater in the medium term in observational studies than in the short term in experiments. However, when we look at the effects, which were significant, this interesting pattern emerges when, although over the short term, extreme events had a significant positive effect on invasive species, it is in the medium term that ocean warming will have a larger positive effect on invasion success. So to sum up these results, what can I say? Well, I want to emphasize here that the answers to these questions are based only on the studies included in my meta-analysis and may therefore change as more data become available. Nevertheless, I found that there was a hotspot for invasive species in terms of donor regions, which Japan. Climate change generally facilitates marine invasions in which invader colonization and abundance seem to be most strongly affected. And finally, both extreme events and ocean warming had significant positive effects on invader success, but it depended on temporal scale and or study type. So I don't think I have time to wrap up. Do I have time to say what was happening? Okay, so if I have a little bit of time, I'll tell you what I plan to do here at at Concordia in May. So ultimately, I'm interested in the responses of invasive species to climate change in the oceans and its effects on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, and thereby the goods and services that people rely on for a sustainable future. I'm also interested in system attributes that confer resilience to ocean ecosystems in the face of these disruptions, as well as human interventions that can promote these attributes, which in turn affect ecosystem resilience and ocean sustainability. Now, this conceptual diagram helps me to develop my research questions, and it's not intended to show all possible relationships between components, and I'm aware that there are more complex diagrams out there. So my research is framed by 5 interconnected questions. Don't worry, I won't go through all 5 of those today. I will just talk about the first 2 if I have a chance. And these were, can invaders, okay, there we go. Can invaders traits predict the type of responses of an invasive species to climate change, and which climate change stresses elicit the largest response in invasive species? So my first question covers the first branch of the conceptual diagram in the red box. That is, can invader traits predict the type of responses of invasive species to climate change? So for example, here I have performance curves for 3 invasive species designated in purple, orange, and red, while the gray band represents the current limiting temperatures, such as current limiting factor, which is temperature in this case, and looked at maximum summer surface temperatures. Now, as this mean shifts to the right with climate change, the purple invasive species is expected to decline, while the orange and red are expected to thrive under these conditions. It's obviously impossible to derive species response curves for every single invasive species. So it'd be useful to be able to predict which species will thrive and which ones won't. It could be that the red and orange species have some trait that explains why the optimal temperature is higher. For example, the red or orange invasive species could be the infamous Pacific oyster, and there's some conflict about that, which maybe we'll talk about, maybe we won't. The Pacific oyster has several spawning strategies, which are associated with different phytoplankton blooming scenarios and are linked to warming water temperatures. And so basically what's happening here is that as temperatures warm, the Pacific oysters switch from being, I think it was something like, I should probably get this number right. Let me see. I can't remember, but anyway, just switches from a moderate percentage of its population have become an asynchronous spawner to literally 100% of its population becoming synchronous spawners by the year 2100. And this is important because synchronous spawning is the most effective sort of spawning strategy for these oysters in terms of its ability to colonize new areas. So there are 3 strategies, but by the 2100, there'll be 1, and the 1 strategy that's left will be the most effective. And so, like I said before, climate change is not some nebulous topic. And so I looked at what climate stressors might most strongly affect invasive species, and does this vary with temporal scale? So here I have an example of the lionfish, since I'm most used to that system. And as you can see, like this is not real data here. This is just me thinking about what could possibly happen. And so right now we have extreme events having the largest positive effect on lionfish. And this is actually supported by previous studies that have shown that hurricanes have increased both the abundance and spread of lionfish throughout the Bahamian archipelago. When there's a series of 4 hurricanes that occurred, it just went crazy. And whereas something like ocean acidification might have negligible effects on lionfish, at least in the short term, so we had kind of put that on the 0 axis there in the coefficient plot. So I won't talk more about that, but I'm just going to say that my lab is called a Deco lab, like Art Deco, and it's for drivers of environmental change in our oceans. And if any of you are interested in doing a master's or a PhD with me, come and find me. I'll be at Concordia as of May, and I am accepting students. And to conclude, my research spans 3 major drivers of environmental change in our oceans and examines some of the interactions between these drivers. I aim to produce applied, rigorous research informed by strong theoretical foundations that address some of society's most pressing environmental questions. Furthermore, by communicating my findings to policymakers and the public at large, I hope to give our oceans and the people that rely on them a sustainable future. Thank you. Yeah, so they do lionfish derbies. They also created a commercial fishery for lionfish as well. But in terms, and then they have scheduled culling events that happen on reefs that are important for biological reasons, such as within MPAs or for recreational dive industries. Now, whether or not that culling is successful depends on a lot of factors. And one of my publications actually showed that it's actually really not successful under when hurricanes pass through. Basically, when a hurricane passes through the system and you continue to cull, and this study went on for 2 years, we actually found that reefs in which you culled lionfish were worse off and had more lionfish than reefs in which you did absolutely nothing at all. In this study, this effect was sustained for 12 months after the storm passed by. It was a Category 4 hurricane. But then when we looked at different culling frequencies, we found that culling quarterly and biannually was equally as effective as to each other. So anyway, I looked at different culling frequencies, and I looked at natural disturbance and how these affect basically conservation outcomes. And the same thing occurs with the derbies, where the derbies are successful under some situations where lionfish colonization rates are low, but in reefs where recolonization rates are high, they're not successful at reducing populations to a level in which you mitigate the negative impact they have on native biota. So though you're getting drops in abundance, those abundances don't drop substantially enough to halt the decline in native prey fish. So actually, one really cool project that I have incoming master's student doing for me in September in the Bahamas is we're going to do some empirical work where basically you take lionfish out to the field, you drop them in these big seawater tanks, you crank up the heat in some of those tanks and leave them ambient temperatures and others. And what we do is we look at, with higher temperatures, you expect increased metabolic rates, which will lead to increased predation rates. So we're looking at predation rates, but also we're looking at, because lionfish prey on herbivorous fishes such as parrotfish, which are very important in herbivores and reefs that control the amount of algae that overgrows the reef. We actually look at the predation effects of lionfish on parrotfish under climate change conditions, so under elevated heat, and how, if that cascades down the food web and therefore actually changes primary productivity, so the primary productivity increases under climate change conditions because of the big slam that the herbivores are getting because of increased predation by lionfish, and then comparing that to ambient conditions. So that's some of the types of experiments that we're looking at. And then I have another student that's looking at some other invaders and basically looking at their performance with ecologically similar native species, and looking at their performance under increased temperatures or changes in oxygen levels, and basically looking at how do native species that are ecologically similar respond under climate change in relation to invasive species under those changing conditions.